Hi, my name's Matt Price, technician here at Leoti American Implement. I've been a technician here for about 12 years, been working full-time on combines for a couple years now. This is our combine service portion of our combine clinic. We're going to hit some of the main key points of the combine service. First thing we're going to touch on is the Feederhouse. This is basically where everything goes into the machine. On my first slide, I've got the multi-coupler. This is the first thing that you hook up to whenever you hook up to a head or something like that to start your harvest. Whenever you hook up to this multi-coupler, you need to make sure that it is very clean. You need to make sure that all the hydraulic ports are clean, the connector is clean itself. When you clean this connector, you want to make sure that you use a glass cleaner, not something super abrasive like a brake and parts cleaner. The brake and parts cleaner can eat away at the plastic in that connector, and it'll become brittle and start breaking apart and you'll lose connection. On my next slide, I've got a picture of how to properly adjust the Feederhouse conveyor chain. On the left, you'll see a chain adjuster that is properly adjusted. You want the leading edge of that washer to go halfway into that notch on that guide. The right picture on the screen is over-tightened. When you over-tighten the adjuster, you can over-tighten it and you won't even know. This adjuster is way over tight, and as you can see, it's just at the bottom of the notch. So make sure that leading edge of that washer is halfway in that notch. On my next slide, I've got a couple part numbers. There is a new style adjuster. It's used on the newer S670s and the new S770s. The new adjuster is 5 millimeters shorter. There's also a spacer that goes with that. What this allows is that chain to get a little bit tighter, and so the chain jumping a cog on the teeth of the upper sprockets is pretty much eliminated by putting this guide on. On my next slide, I've got a picture of the stone trap, the rock trap. It's very important to open this up every night before you go home after your harvest day. As you're going through the field, that collects all the stones and other large objects that could potentially hurt your rotor, your feed accelerator, and stuff like that inside the combine. So when that fills up, it needs to be emptied. When it fills up and you don't empty it that day and you go harvest the next day and it keeps on going, all that stuff is going to go right into the rotor and start breaking tines off and stuff like that. So you need to be careful to empty that every night. On my next slide, we're going to start talking about the separator and all the key points of that. On the next slide, we've got a picture of one of the top covers. The top covers on the S-Series, 9770s, any of the rotor machines, they're one of the high wear points on it. The top covers like to wear it on the front left corner, and they'll get a hole in it. A lot of people have put a patch over that as a temporary fix, and that's okay. I mean, that'll get you through harvest and what you need to do to not be down for a long time. It takes a long time to change out those top covers, and so you don't want to be down during harvest changing out top covers. So most people just plate that instead. On my next slide, you can see a better picture of those holes that develop in that top cover. When those holes get large enough and they've been plated over, that top cover material will start bubbling out. And you can see the couple places where it's bubbling out and crop and material is getting stuck behind that. When that starts bubbling out, that interrupts the flow of crop and the straw and the stalks and everything moving up the rotor, and so it doesn't feed as well. Also, you'll see on that same picture there's some fins on that top rotor cover. One of them, you can see that it's bent. When those bend, because everything's getting thinner and weak, when that bends, it keeps stuff from flowing up. Those fins are actually what flows the material from the bottom of the rotor all the way up to the top. And so when they bend, it interrupts the flow and doesn't feed as well. On my next slide, I've got a picture of the feed accelerator and the feed accelerator wear strips. When these wear strips wear about halfway on the leading edge, they become rounded. It's about time to flip it. On this picture, they're wore right at half, so it's a good time to flip them now. If you wait too long, it will not feed as well. The the teeth of those feed accelerator wear strips will not grab the straw and stuff as it's coming through as well, and it won't feed as well. You can flip them once, and typically you can get another season or two, a couple of years out of them, and prolong the life of them. After you've flipped them once and it gets to where the height of them is shortening, it's time to replace them. On my next slide on the left, I've got a picture of the choppers. Not every machine has a chopper, but there's a few special points to hit on a chopper. The choppers have knives, the stationary knives that come up from the bottom. If you're picking corn, they need to be out and not engaged. When you're cutting wheat, milo, whatever, you can engage those, and whatever your preference is where you'll set those. In corn, if you engage those, they will wear out very, very fast. On the right side of this slide, there's a picture of the cob deflector door lever. Whenever you are picking corn and you have a chopper, you need to have that cob deflector door down. That way it'll protect your chaffer. On my next slide here, I've got a picture of a chaffer element that is broken, primarily because the cob deflector door was left up and those cobs came in and hit everything on the chaffer element and broke out several of the fingers. On my next slide, I've got a picture of the new style moisture sensors. This new style, very easy to clean, very easy to maintain. The picture of the auger on the left, typically in milo and crops like that, it'll gum up. If you're having issues with your moisture sensor, it's 2 pins and you can pull that auger out and look at that and make sure it's good and clean. The picture on the right is an actual picture up from the bottom of the moisture sensor. You can look up in there and make sure it's all good and clean. That way you're making sure that it's reading the right moisture as you're going through the field. On my next slide is a picture of the impact plate. This is also called the mass flow impact plate. This is inside the fountain auger. You fold down your fountain auger and this plate is right there. This is what actually measures your yield as you're going through the field. These plates, they're a plastic plate. They're kind of susceptible to higher wear. So make sure that it's good. If it's smaller than what it was originally, it's time to replace it. If it's smaller than it was originally, it's not going to read the correct yield. On my next slide, on the left, I've got a picture of a standard concave. This is the small wire, small grains concave. They are kind of susceptible to having white caps when you're using like a Shelbourne head and stuff like that. Shelbourne highly recommends that you put in interrupter bars, or if you're having issues with white caps on your wheat, to put in the interrupter bars. You can see on the picture on the right that the space between the bars is about half. These interrupter bars really help out a lot with white caps. On my next section, we're going to talk about greasing the machine and what kind of lubricants you should use. My next slide is a picture of the greasing decal on the left-hand side of the machine. These are located right underneath the concave closures. Basically, it hits on every point except for what's on the feeder house on the left-hand side of the machine. Most of these grease points are 400 hours or they're 50 hour. There's not very many 10-hour grease zerks on this machine. I know a lot of farmers really like to grease their machine every morning when they show up to the field. They're going through their startup process. They're fueling up the machines. They like to have somebody going through and greasing everything. That's okay, but cut down how much you're greasing it. Most of the 400 hours and the 50-hour grease zerks are 10 to 15 pumps each time you grease it. So if you're greasing it every day, 1 or 2 pumps, you'll be good. On my next slide is the right-hand side decal. Same thing here. A lot of them are 400 hours or 50 hours. Same thing if you're going to grease it every day. 1 to 2 pumps is plenty good. My next slide is a picture of the reverser and how to properly grease it. There's 2 grease zerks on the reverser. You want to set those at 12 o'clock and 2 o'clock. When they're at 12 o'clock, you want to grease that top grease zerk about 5 to 8 pumps if you're greasing it every day, every 10 hours of operation. The 2 o'clock one, you want to do that about every 3 to 5 pumps. Again, if you're doing that every 10 hours. The 2 o'clock can be over-greased. When you over-grease that, say you put 15, 20 pumps in that, or you're using an electric grease gun and you really put a lot of grease in it, that grease is going to come out between the shivs, and that's going to get on the belt and could potentially ruin a belt. The 12 o'clock position one, you can't over-grease that. That's just going to come out underneath that spring, and it's just going to go out. It won't hurt anything there. On my next slide is the upper variable drive. These grease zerks are kind of hidden unless that top variable drive is turned just right. You can kind of reach behind there and feel for them. What I do is I'll turn that pulley until those grease zerks are at the very bottom, and then you can see them underneath. You want to grease those. It's a 400-hour grease zerk. Like I said, you can grease it every day, 1 to 2 pumps. If you do grease it, make sure you grease both of them, both the grease zerks there, and make sure that you don't blow the seal out between the shivs. So every time I grease it, I look in between there and make sure that seal is still in place. On my next slide is a picture of the reel pump and the reel pump carrier. Again, this is a 400-hour grease zerk. I recommend greasing it every day. 1 to 2 pumps is plenty good for it. You're not going to over-grease this. So if you do put 4 or 5 pumps in there, if it feels like it needs more, go ahead and put those 4 to 5 pumps in there. In the past, this is notorious for starting fires on combines. Those bearings will go bad, and there's chaff and debris and stuff stuck behind that because there's a little cavity behind that, and it can potentially cause a fire if those bearings go bad. That's why I recommend greasing it every day rather than waiting for the 400 hours. And it's also kind of a hidden grease zerk, so it does get missed quite often. So just make sure you get to that one. On my next slide is the rotor variable drive over on the left-hand side of the machine. There's a plug in the side of that, and it kind of is at an angle, and it's a 400-hour grease, and I recommend doing that every 400 hours. I wouldn't recommend doing that any more than that, and it's going to take about 40 to 45 pumps of grease. It's going to take quite a bit of grease to go in there. That's 400 hours, like I said. Once you get done, you're going to have to pull that plug out, and you're going to put a grease zerk in. When you're done greasing it, put that plug back in so you don't over-grease it. If you over-grease that grease is going to come out between the shivs, and you're going to ruin a rotor belt. Those rotor belts aren't cheap, so you definitely don't want to over-grease that and ruin that belt. On my next slide is the chopper jack shaft. This also runs the pump for the spreaders if it has a spreader. Every machine has it, even though it's called the chopper jack shaft. Even if it doesn't have a chopper, it still has this jack shaft. There's 2 plugs on it. I've got a picture of the front side of it with the plug. That plug, you're going to pull it out, and you're going to grease it, and you can leave the grease zerk in on this one. Also, there's one on the back side. You don't have to grease both of them, but it's a good idea to at least put zerks in both of them. That way it does get greased. This is also a 400-hour grease zerk. I recommend greasing it every day. The outside of that has a belt on it, and that bearing gets quite a bit hotter because of that belt and the friction there. On my next slide, I've got a picture here of a Lincoln luber. These are automatic lubers, very, very easy and efficient way to grease the machine. By far the best way to grease it. The Lincoln lubers, the automatic lubers, they will grease the bearings as they're hot and as they're moving, which is the best way to grease a bearing. You don't want to be out there stopping halfway through the day to grease your bearings and have the machine running. It's kind of unsafe to do that. With these Lincoln lubers, they'll grease it for you and you don't have to worry about it. There's a few grease zerks that you still have to get to, like the Feederhouse ones, the rotating assemblies. You still have to grease those. But greasing 5 grease zerks every day versus greasing 50, it saves you a lot of time in the mornings. On my next section, I'm going to talk about the very cool fan drives. Not all of the combines have them. Most of them do anymore. On my first slide here, it shows a picture of the grease zerk and the vent out the end. When you grease this, if it's been recently serviced, like the bushings have been changed or something like that, it's going to have synthetic grease in it. They used to have cornhead grease in it. So if it hasn't been serviced for a while, it's going to have cornhead grease in it. When you lube it, you need to put cornhead grease back in it. So if it's been recently serviced, you need to put the synthetic grease back in it. When you grease that, a couple pumps is all it'll need, no more than 5 pumps. And it can come out the breather on the end, the vent. That's okay. Make sure you rev up the combine and slow it back down after you do that to cycle those shivs. On my next slide, I've got a picture of the driven assembly. There's a couple plugs on those and a vent on the end. We've been telling guys to go ahead and pull one plug on each side of the shaft out and put a grease zerk in, and you can leave those grease zerks in. Same thing on this one. If it's been recently serviced, then it will have the synthetic grease in it. If it's been a little while, it'll have the cornhead grease in it. My next section, we're going to talk about the ultimate performance inspections, the American Implement Up inspection. I've got on here, it's only $595. This is a 7-hour inspection. If you were to pay outright for 7 hours, that's $714. This is one of the best values that you will get. You are saving money, and you're also getting peace of mind knowing what's wrong with the machine and what can go wrong with it. On this slide, I've got a picture of one of our estimates. This is just an estimate that I've made up. It's not an actual estimate. This is the format that we use to present the estimates to the customers. On here, over to the left, we've got priorities. Basically, a priority 1 is something that really needs to be done right now. It's probably not going to make it through harvest, or it's really bad and it needs to be addressed right now. A priority 2 is something that could potentially last through this harvest and maybe the fall harvest, something that you definitely want to keep an eye on and make sure that it's not going bad, something to look at every day, stuff like that. The way that we've done our estimates is by line item, and so replacing one item, it'll have a parts cost and then it'll have a labor cost with it. Sometimes some of those will overlap. And so when we go over the combine estimates with our customers going around the machine, we let them know that these two will overlap and it'll be a little bit cheaper and stuff like that. The customers have really liked the priority system. With grain prices the way they are, they're not going up right now. It gives the customer an opportunity to maybe put off a little bit of their service, something that they can do maybe, stuff like that. On my next slide, I've got a picture of the footrest in the S770. This is also on the newer S670s, 680s, and 690s. There is a kit number on this slide that shows you the kit that you can use to put it on the older S670s. I've got a lot of customers that really like that footrest. It really adds a little bit more comfort, and it is really worth it at the end. You're not near as tired at the end of the day. Also on this side, I've got a picture of the S770 armrest. There's a lot changed on it. The buttons are totally different. They're a lot easier to push. This armrest is a lot easier to run than the older ones are, so I wanted to attach a picture of that. That concludes my presentation for the service part of our combine clinic.